This lecture continues to look at South Asia before 1200 with the Gupta and Pallava dynasties. The Gupta period, or dynasty, lasts between 300 and 550 Common Era, which roughly overlaps with the spread of Christianity, and this is where we find the first influential forms of Hinduism appearing, and the earliest Hindu temples coming from the same period. Now, overlapping with Christianity, we find this period is one of change throughout the Eastern and Western worlds. Now, Hinduism is going to evolve out of the Vedas or the Vedic tradition, for we have Hindu deities represent not one religion, but innumerable belief systems that come from a combination of these Vedic beliefs combined with indigenous beliefs in these populations in India. They all are drawn on the Vedas texts that are going to be written between 1200 and 800 BCE that relate that the gods lie outside of the finite world, but can appear here in our world, our material world, with us, and we can see them and interact with them. Each one of these sects throughout India where Hinduism spreads has a particular deity that is considered supreme, much like those that are going to support different Sumerian cities in Mesopotamia. You would worship one primary god. This is not unusual. We find that the worship of the gods is necessary in Hinduism so that you can be reborn into higher and higher positions until eventually one escapes samsara, or the perpetual birth, death, and rebirth that we have, chaining us to this material existence. The most popular Hindu deities, even though it is impossible to name all of them, are four, specifically Vishnu, Shiva, Devi, and Brahma. Vishnu is one of the most benevolent gods and is considered the creator, for he works for order and well-being of this world. He is often shown, as we will see today, laying in a trance on the cosmic waters, where he dreamed the world into existence, not unlike the aboriginal dreaming or the dream time, where we have these ancient supernatural forces that create the world before humans. Shiva, on the other hand, is dual-natured, representing both creation and destruction, light and darkness, male and female aspects of life, and the ascetic and family man. So we find that he is a contradiction but represents the binary or dual nature in all of us. He is often shown, and most popularly shown here, as the Lord of the Dance, who's going to be forever in this cosmic dance, representing the endless cycle of death and rebirth, destruction and creation, also tied to his dual nature and how he's going to be seen as both destructor and creator. He's going to have as his consort, or his lover, Parvati, and together they're going to have two sons, Ganesha, who is the elephant-headed remover of obstacles people are very familiar with in Hinduism, as well as Kartikeya, who is the war god, the equivalent of Ares or of Mars in the Greco-Roman tradition. Now, Devi is the great goddess who controls material riches and fertility. Interestingly enough, like Dionysus in the Greek tradition, she provides vital forces to all male gods, and of course that vitality is also going to relate to their fertility. Brahma represents spiritual wisdom, and this god is often shown with four heads representing the four cosmic cycles, as well as the four directions and the four classes of society that Hindus developed beyond that of the previous civilization, the Vedic tradition, and that is priests, warriors, merchants, and then finally laborers. So we have an additional almost mercantile class that's added to this in addition to food producers. Now, there are countless deities, but all of them are worshipped similarly. We find that the form of worship that is taken for these deities in the Hindu religion is known as puja, whereas darshan means that one beholds a deity. Now, deities are going to be seen and are going to be closely associated with the development of Hindu temples. They come around the 4th century and are going to displace Vedic sacrifice and replacing it with this temple-based practice of this priesthood. So Brahmin priests would elevate these new deities and build temples in order to pray to them, to satiate them. Now, there are 2 basic varieties of Hindu temples that we will look at. Today, we'll focus on the northern style temples, which looks much more like a mountain or a series of mountains, whereas the southern style temple is much more flat and so represents the topography of the southern area in India where they develop. They are designed to represent mountains either way, with one chamber inside, the Garbhagriha. The Garbhagriha literally means the womb chamber. And it is where we have this sacred cavern within this cosmic mountain, and the gods live there. And so we find that this is where we can commune with them best. Here we have some of the earliest examples of these temples that have survived. In this example, you have the Vishnu temple that's going to be in Uttar Pradesh in India, produced in the Gupta dynasty around 530 Common Era. Again, it is dedicated to Vishnu, this creator god, and is designed on the mandala, or the sacred diagram of the universe, or the cosmological blueprint of the universe, much as we discussed last time with Buddhism. Now, the relief panels that are carved on all the sides represent windows that let the light of the god out of the temple to illuminate us in the exterior world. Here we have examples of the 3 different windows coupled with the singular entrance in this Hindu temple. Thus, we find that these supernatural beings are not abstractions, but quite literally are going to be affecting the world. Here we find Vishnu lying on the cosmic waters in this relief of 530, roughly 5 feet tall. This story of creation for Hindus shows Vishnu, this creator, sleeping on the serpent of infinity, known as Ananta, whose body coils endlessly. Here is a detail showing, again, these serpents or these cobras with hoods above the head of Vishnu, as we find the coils are much like pillows underneath him, as the serpent is going to coil over and over and over and over endlessly. At his feet, Lakshmi is going to be holding his feet, stirring him to dream up the universe, inspiring him, if you will. At the top, we find that Brahma is going to be born out of the lotus blossom from Vishnu's navel, and he in turn transforms himself into space and time, thus making the world possible, making creation possible. More popularly, this is how the image is often shown, where you have Vishnu with 4 arms on this serpent with a lotus blossom coming out of his navel and Brahma on it, while again a female figure is going to be holding his foot. Now, with the figures here, we have Vishnu's 4 primary attributes ready to fight the 2 demons that are going to try to attack and kill Brahma. You find that if they are successful and kill Brahma, that creation will be jeopardized. It will not be possible. And so we find Vishnu, the creator god who is dreaming, protects creation. Now, the size of Vishnu, as in the hierarchy of scale, he is much larger than any of the other deities surrounding him, relates to his omnipotence, that he is all-powerful. The sensuous lines and the fact that he is lightly garbed, and we cannot really tell the difference between where he is clothed or naked, comes from the Mayuran dynasty and or art that we talked about last time, such as in the Buddha example here to the left. Especially the rich detailed jewelry also relate to this lavish, sensuous style. Looking closely, we see the details of the jewelry here, thus, of course, celebrating this worldliness that is going to be appropriate for the indigenous Indian tradition. These divine stories, as mentioned, are not abstractions. We do not see abstract forms, but instead they are acted out by gods in superhuman form, size, and scale. So we find that the reaction to these and engagement with them is very physical. And we will see that at the end of today's class, to where this type of physical appreciation and worship of the gods can be represented in an erotic fashion. Now, Buddhism was also popular even with the rise of Hinduism, and the Gupta style is also going to be used for Buddha statues, such as the Buddha preaching his first sermon seen here at Uttar Pradesh in India, roughly between 465 and 485 Common Era. It is life-size at 5 feet 3 inches tall, and is going to, as the Gupta style is so commonly going to demonstrate, show the refined elegance and the purity of surfaces, almost abstracting the form here. We have all of the identifying markers and characteristics of Buddha present. The Ujnisha, the top knot that he has here representing enlightenment on the top of his head. We have the Urna, the mark between his eyebrows. And we have the Chakra, the wheels on his palms and on his feet. The gesture that he is making is a specific one that we talked about in the mudra system of hand gestures, whereby we have the Dharma chakra, where he is teaching with hands at chest level, with the wheels set in motion. Unlike the have no fear gesture we talked about last time, that is going to be seen here to the right. So each gesture is very significant for Buddhists. Now here we have the sensuous lines, in which he is also lightly garbed with detailed jewelry. In this case, he's wearing jewelry, which is unusual for Buddha, thus relating it to the other Hindu works of art being produced at the same time. Turning to rock-hewn art and temples, we have the Ajanta caves. That's going to be in central India. Here we find a rock-cut monastery with more than 20 large caves, each one with its own patron, reliefs, and painting. Now, the narrative episodes that are going to be shown in here relate to Buddha's past lives or to bodhisattvas, those individuals who put off enlightenment to help others attain it. Now, this is going to be carved much like Egyptian Middle Kingdom tombs and temples, directly from living rock instead of being assembled and built with a post-and-lintel system. So we find that this is not new by way of technology, but is going to be more refined in the East with these artists who are building the Hindu and Buddhist temples that spread throughout the world. The widespread tradition of these rock-cut temples is going to be well known, that we'll discuss across the Silk Road, for instance. The sculpture in these temples is quite abundant, but painting is quite rare. But when we do have examples of painting, it illustrates the same interests of the Gupta style. Here we find a bodhisattva that's going to be found in Cave 1 at Ajanta in India. So in this one, painted around 475 Common Era, we have a surviving painting of a bodhisattva, or an enlightened one following Buddhist principles, who postpones nirvana in order to help others achieve enlightenment. Now, distinguishing them from Buddha proper with a capital B, these individuals are going to be shown wearing princely garments, bejeweled crowns, large earrings, pearl necklaces, armbands, and bracelets. Obviously, they're reveling in the worldly attire and their rank, much as princes would, whereas Buddha has given them up. So comparing it to Buddha, we find that bodhisattvas are going to represent this type of elegant decor and of kind of superfluous decoration, whereas Buddha is much more severe and much more stark in how he is going to be shown, and how he does not wear jewelry very often, and certainly not the type of bejeweled crown with the bodhisattvas. The design, we'll notice, is going to balance realism with a sensuous languor, as the bodhisattva is going to be swaying to one side, holding up this flower, tilting the head towards the viewer below, with his eyes half-lidded in this very lush scenery. So the naturalism is going to be much like that in Hindu art as well, as we're celebrating the detail in the jewelry and the finery, and also the sensuous erotic overtones of the soft features of these forms as they sway. Now, turning to Afghanistan, we find that these rock-hewn temples and sculptures are going to make their way to the west along the Silk Road. Now, the Silk Road stretched all the way from China to the west and was a primary trading route and conduit for goods and ideas that are going to cross over these vast territories. Buddhist travelers are going to carve directly from the rock cliff nearly 200-foot high statues of Buddha for protection along their pilgrimage and their journeys between these areas. Here we have many very large Buddhas that act as these type of markers or apotropaic guardian figures, if you will. Here we have the standing Buddha from Afghanistan, carved around the 5th century Common Era, and it's going to be 175 foot tall. We can see the face and the legs in this photograph are missing, but we still have the long earlobes, the monk's robe, and of course the ushnisha or top knot. Now these are much like the massive statues, or colossi as they are known, being the plural of colossus, built in ancient Egypt, such as at the Temple of Ramses II, where we sacrifice detail and naturalism for scale and sheer size. In this particular example, there's a staircase in the cliff that leads to Buddha's shoulder, where we see the sun god in the vault above. As we are pilgrimaging to the heavens, we circumambulate around again Buddha and then travel back down. So this notion of circumambulation is central to Buddhist worship, and we talked about that at the great stupa at Sanchi. And so much like with different traditions, especially in Islam, where it is customary annually on your Hajj to go to Mecca and then circumambulate, right, in a particular fashion, so too do Buddhists also practice this type of meditative circumambulation. Now, in 2001, the Taliban destroyed this Buddha statue as they considered it idolatrous. Not long after, in 2015, we recently saw ISIS destroying antiquities as well, especially Assyrian art, as they wanted to set up this new caliphate in Syria. So, of course, we find that many of the antiquities that are produced that we're discussing in this class in highly volatile regions, such as the Middle East and parts of Asia, do not survive because they are either considered to be idolatrous or merely because they're in a war zone. Turning to the far south in Sri Lanka, we have also these rock-cut and hewn palaces that are being built using much the same technology. Here, the palace on a high plateau above a forest was designed at Sigiriya as the new capital for Sri Lanka by a king in the 5th century. That being King Kasyapa, who ruled between 477 and 95, is going to abandon this at his death. His people will. Yet we still have this monumental palace with frescoes that still survive to this day, a testament of the monumentality that can be achieved with these rock-hewn structures. Now, it was turned into a Buddhist monastery and functioned as such until the 14th century, and its isolation is going to relate why this is the case. Here we have an entryway where we first must pass a broad moat to an elaborate terrace series of gardens. So here we have what is left over of the terraces and the moat. And here is an aerial view of the area, this long procession. So anyone approaching the main entrance to this palace could easily be detected and watched. And of course, it made it easy to defend as well. Now you're passing through, walking up the side of this great cliff face, a massive chest of a lion whose feet remain, as can be seen on either side of the staircase. But that is all of the lion that remains. Remember that Buddha's first sermon was considered to be a lion's roar, and so we have lions associated with Buddha. The stairs along the cliff face were painted with murals of maidens in the clouds and have the same type of erotic, sensuous appeal as the Gupta tradition we just looked at. Here we have two of them holding again flowers and blossoms, wearing very articulate jewelry and necklaces, oversized earrings and crowns. Some are nude, some are clothed, but they have the same type of elegant naturalism that is balanced by these outlines that clearly define their shapes as they sway inward, looking downward in a half-lidded way, averting their gaze in a coy, very passively seductive fashion. So we still have this notion of tying together the erotic with the divine. Only the foundations, unfortunately, remain of the buildings below, as well as their cisterns. But this was a very impressive palace when it was in use and when Buddhists used it for a monastery. Now, turning to the Temple of Shiva at the island of Elephanta, we have dedicated here various incarnations of Shiva in this one monument. This is to the far west. Here we have Shiva shown as the great yogi, as the slayer of demons, and as the cosmic dancer. Here, this Hindu rock-cut architecture is going to show us that, unlike other Buddhist examples where we have one entrance, at Elephanta there are three entrances, north, east, and west. The interior space is illuminated only from the light of the entrances. Thus, we get a backlit effect on the interior space, leading to the central shrine for this god, which is going to be highlighted here. So the cave temple of Shiva is going to show rock-cut pillars that are purely decorative and have no structural function. They do not hold up the pillars or the ceiling here. Just like the Middle Kingdom caves in Egypt, they are decorative. The so-called fluted and cushioned capitals are called as such because they look like cushions in this sense, are going to be in the same place we would find Doric, Ionic, or Corinthian capitals for the ancient Greeks. The focus is going to be on the east-west axis and the Linga shrine, which is the center focus for Shiva and worship of this god here. Here is the central Linga shrine that is going to showcase this abstract image of this dual-natured god. Here, the linga, or lingam, as it is also called, is an abstract symbol of Shiva, shown as the formless one, or Brahman, that which exists outside of space and time as the eternal one. So you find that the form is going to have very obvious references to different types of sex organs in an abstract fashion, because Shiva is both male and female, and because he represents both sides of existence. The focus of the north-south axis is actually going to be a massive bust of Shiva seen here at the left. This is going to show the three different heads of Shiva. The one facing forward is going to show Shiva in deep introspection with a heavy lower lip, showing the god's serious depth and gravity of his existence. Off to the side, we find that the protector nature is going to be shown as female. Thus, we have a softer female form to the figure's face, as well as these curls that relate to the hair, which is seen as feminine. The other side, we have Shiva as the wrathful destroyer, showing his destructive nature with snakes around his neck, much like in other cultures and traditions like the Aztecs. These Hindu temples will be further patronized by monarchs who seek to compete with the palaces and the temples of their own patronage with the other temples commissioned and run by priests. Here from the 7th to the 12th century, these regional monarchs will continue to build massive rock-hewn temples. This would be the apex of South Asian rock-cut art that is also going to be found here on the western coast in Maharashtra. The Kailasha temple at Ellora is one of the final greatest examples of rock-cut temples, with 34 caves in all, dedicated here to Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism. We have it patronized by Krishna I, who ruled between 757 and 83 Common Era. Here, the Kailasha temple at Ellora is going to tie this notion of Hindu temples as mountains that are going to ascend upward and that are going to house deities, is going to be realized fully and literally here, as it is carved from one solid rock. The two-story carving here from one massive stone is set into the mountainside, requiring the builders and the carvers to cut 107 feet straight down, much like Trajan's army of workers had in order to create the Market of Trajan and the Column of Trajan. The two-story carving is actually going to be from one massive stone seen here, much like other rock-hewn tombs in ancient Egypt, cut into the walls with the same type of cushion capitals we just saw a moment ago for the Temple of Shiva. We are meant to circumambulate at ground level where there are narrative scenes and large elephants supporting the lower plinth that tower above us, just as we have the sequential towering of each one of these sections of this temple that is literally a mountain. So the metaphor now becomes this literal association between the temple and the mountain, and is even named for Shiva's abode on Mount Kailasha in the Himalayas, where the god actually exists and lives. Now, this particular rock-hewn temple is incredibly impressive, but is far too rural, as you can see here from the photograph, as it's not in an urban area, so it cannot function properly as a Hindu temple. Therefore, it's much more appropriate for Buddhist monastic communities. So this is the last great rock-cut Hindu temple, for in the future, donors will favor these built structures in major urban areas that we will look at now. Hindu temples like the one at Khajuraho, the capital of the Chandela dynasty, where we find that there are over 80 temples constructed in this one period alone, we have an example of what Hindu temple design will be like moving forward. Here in the northern style temple in northern India, we have those that are going to relate to the shape of a mountain much more literally, with the type of axis mundi rising up, and the mandapas usually rising higher and higher until we get to this peak. Now, the dominant construction throughout all of history is going to use the post-and-lintel, which has vertical posts with horizontal lintels or beams above them. Thus, of course, we find that the Hindu temples do not use mortar, but are instead supported by way of gravity alone. In this case, we find one dedicated to Shiva, and again at Madhya Pradesh in India, we have around 1000 Common Era, a temple that hides where the joints actually occur and rises dramatically from section to section until we have this mountainous apex that houses the god. The curvilinear shikara, or dome, is over 100 feet above the Garbhagriha, the inner shrine that is the womb chamber for the god. Now, on the stone terrace, we have an entryway leading us up with steps to 3 mandapas, or these pillared outdoor halls that precede the Garbhagriha, in which we are going to enter more and more deeply into this temple before coming face to face with the god himself or herself. Here we can see the different porch, the mandapa, and the great mandapa in the center that leads eventually to the Garbhagriha. This one, of course, the womb chamber, is shaped as such, and thus, of course, protects the god. The shikara, or dome, is going to be bolstered by smaller subsidiary towers off to the side that obscures the shape of the main dome, much as we see with Muqarnas decorations in Islamic architecture. The domes over the mandapas grow progressively taller and taller as we move to the main one, giving us the impression of an ascent up a mountain. It is encrusted with sculpture 3 feet high all the way around, with 600 figures in high relief of gods in erotic postures, engaging with mortals. The amorous couples on the entrances to the temples relate to the 2 new traditions in Hinduism. Those relate to Tantra and bhakti. Tantra literally means esoteric and is one's own self-identification with a deity, where we find no separation between the self and the divine. And so we find there is this connection that can be seen as erotic, if you will. The bhakti means devotional and is one's personal loving relation with a god. So we see them here literally with erotic imagery showing their devotion and unity with the gods. This can be shown in many ways, but in many different religions it's shown quite physically as a union in an erotic way, a union with the gods and mortals. So here we have examples throughout in various ways of kissing, groping, and or in conjugal acts. We find that these gods are going to be communed with in a very visceral and physical way. And we find that therefore they exist here and can be present in our reality. This is not unlike the idea in the Christian tradition of mystical love, which is represented as sensuous and courtly love, such as the Sponsa Christi, as Mary is shown as the bride of Christ, which is the prelude here to the mystical kiss, cheek to cheek, that the Mother of God is going to be sharing with her Son. In the later traditions of the Baroque, this is going to be externalized in these emotions shown as physical kind of feelings here of a narrative climax, with examples like the ecstasy of Saint Teresa, hence engaging very physically and sensuously with the divine. Next time, we'll continue on with the art of Southeast Asia and look at how Hinduism and Buddhism is going to spread there.